Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you.
All right. Thanks, Mike.
I can hear you.
Thanks, Angie.
My God, it's his real world.
Yeah, real world tonight. Mr. Buchita, how was that round of golf this morning?
It was a beautiful morning. That's my only comment.
Nothing like teeing off on number one at Mississippi into the sun and having to guess where your ball went.
Unfortunately, I didn't hit it that far. I could see it.
Clerk Gummo, I'd like to thank you for getting me that information on being a poll worker for this election. I got everything set up and set for the training. So thank you so much.
Thank you for signing up for the November 3rd election.
So, and everyone else, before I get started here, socialize that we still need poll workers. We still need election judges. Put it out in your social media feeds. It'll make Lori's life easier.
I need all the help I can get, Mr. Fellers.
All right, it is 6 o'clock. Let's just give a few more seconds here for anyone else to join, and we will get going. Just a reminder that if you're not speaking, to keep your devices on mute. If you're not on video, please just speak out if you want to, instead of raising your hand, to make a comment or, so that I know to call on you. All right, let's get going. It is Thursday, September 3rd, 2020 at 6 o'clock. This is the Winnebago County Board meeting. Looks like entirely virtually tonight. Clerk Gummo, will you please call the roll?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McDonald.
Present in the chambers.
Mr. Neighbors.
Here.
Mrs. Red.
Here.
Mr. Salgado.
Present.
Mr. Schultz. I can see you, but I didn't hear you, Mr. Schultz. Mr. Tassoni,
Present.
Mr. Webster,
Here.
Mr. Westcott,
Here, also in the chambers.
Mr. Zintak,
Here.
Mr. Arena,
Here.
Mr. Billich,
Here.
Mr. Booker, Mr. Booker, Mr. Butita,
Here.
Mrs. Crosby, Mrs. Crosby, Mr. Fellers,
Here.
Mr. Fiducia,
Here.
Mr. Girl,
Present.
Mrs. Gorel,
Present.
Mr. Hoffman,
Present.
Mr. Kelly.
Here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's 18 present and 2 absent.
Thank you, Clerk Gamow. As Mrs. Crosby is not here for the invocation, I'm actually going to ask that all of you keep her in your thoughts and prayers as she recovers at home from COVID-19. We wish her a speedy recovery and hope that she is back with us soon. In lieu of that, unless there's a volunteer to give the invocation, we will jump straight to the Pledge of Allegiance. Seeing none, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice
Justice
for
for
all.
all.
That's another reason I like being there.
Me too.
Thank you. We have no awards, proclamations, or presentations tonight. We do have one public speaker, so I'll read this first. Comments shall be limited to 3 minutes. Speakers may not address zoning matters which are pending before the ZBA, zoning committee, or the county board. Personnel matters or pending threatened litigation may not be addressed in open session. An individual may speak a maximum of 3 times per calendar year on the same topic. This prohibition shall include the repetition of the same topic in a statement on what is purported to be a different topic. Personal attacks or inappropriate language of any sort will not be tolerated. Do we have Abby Pro on the line? Abby, are you with us? Okay, going once, going twice. All right. Board member correspondence. Is there anything from the board? Seeing none, well, there is no chairman's report. Announcements and communications. Clerk Gamow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The items below were received as correspondence.
Thank you, Clerk Gamow. Those will be placed on record. All right, now the consent agenda. May I have a motion to approve the consent agenda, including the raffle report, the approval of the August 13, 2020 minutes, and the layover of the August 27th, 2020 minutes? Motion by Mr. Billich, second by Mr. Kelly. Is anyone opposed to the consent agenda? Motion passes. Mr. Chapman, Mr. Thompson, anything on your end from the county administrator side?
Thank you, Mr. Fellers. Members of the board, just would like to report that I've continued my one-on-one introductory meetings with appointed department heads, elected constitutional officers, and county board members. I want to thank all the staff for the great welcome and the great discussions that we've started to initiate. And also like to thank the board members that I have met with so far. And I look forward to continuing those one-on-one meetings with county officials. I'm also trying to lend a hand as best I can to Steve Chapman in finalizing the county's budget. And Steve has it well under control, but I'm trying to lend a little bit of assistance as we try to wrap things up. So thank you, Mr. Fellers, for the opportunity to speak to the board, and I would take any questions from the board if there are any at this point.
Are there any questions for Mr. Thompson? Seeing none, are there any department head updates? Dr.
I don't
Martell, I
believe
see-
there are.
Oh,
I don't believe there are, Mr. Fellers.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you. Thanks.
moving on then, unfinished business. We have 4 board appointments tabled by the county board on July 9th, 2020. Seeing no motion, Mr. Kelly,
Move to remove from the table.
we have a motion by Mr. Kelly to remove these 4 appointments from the table. May I have a second, please?
I second it.
Seconded by Mr. Neighbors. Are there any this is a non-debatable item. I will ask the clerk to call the roll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red, Mrs. Red. I will come back to her again. Mr. Salgado,
No.
What are we doing here? I got knocked off.
Mrs. Red, there is a motion to remove the 4 board appointments from the table.
To remove them from the table?
Yes, to take them off the table.
No.
thank you. Mr. Schultz,
Mr.
Mr.
Schultz.
Schultz,
We're having an audio issue. Okay, thank you.
thank you. Mr. Tassoni,
No.
Mr. Webster,
No.
Mr. Westcott,
No.
Mr. Zintek,
No.
Mr. Arena,
No.
Mr. Billich,
No.
Mr. Booker. I'm sorry, he is still absent. Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby is absent. Mr. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Fiducia,
No.
Mr. Girl,
No.
Mrs. Gorel, Mrs. Gorel. Did we lose
No.
Mrs. Gorel? Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. Mr. Hoffman,
No.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
sorry, Mr. Chairman, the motion fails.
Motion
Clerk
fails.
Gummo? Clerk Gummo, Keith McDonald is also a no.
I apologize, Mr. McDonald, also a no.
Okay, motion fails. Moving on to our standing committee reports. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Finance Committee has 5 items tonight. The first one I'm going to go into is number 3, a resolution identify revenue increases or budget reductions to offset the sheriff's budget amendment 2020-020 increase of 2.7 million and change. So I move.
Okay, we have a motion on resolution identifying revenue increases or budget reductions to offset the sheriff's budget amendment 2020-020, an increase of 2.7 million. May I have a second, Mr. Girl? And this item is now open for discussion. Mr. Salgado, would you like to speak to this first?
Yes, I'm gonna hand it over to Mr. Chapman to give some information. He has laid out areas where potentially unspent money could be used to cover that 2.7. So I'd like Mr. Chapman, if you can chime in a little bit and give some more detail and information regarding that. So, Mr. Chapman, are you there?
Go ahead, Mr. Chapman.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We did, based on the resolution, as it was stated, requested that county administration identify revenue increases or budget reductions which would offset the anticipated budget amendment. We went ahead and did that, or we tried to look at certain revenue increases that were unbudgeted. And we also looked at certain expenditures, primarily in the personnel area, that were anticipated to be unspent. We did come up with the 2.724 million. I did it, I believe, sent this out to the board earlier today. Hopefully you saw a copy of it in that, as far as the resolution and the attachment that was along with the resolution. So,
Any questions? Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Chairman. Steve, are all of these items pretty certain? I mean, is there some degree of certainty on these estimates, or are they half certain, or what?
well, most of the personnel items are, we only have one more month of payroll. This is the beginning of September. So I think in that respect, they would be fairly certain. I didn't, a lot of the departments, I didn't take the full amount of what we anticipated not spending. The other areas are certain. So I would say, I'm not going to say 100%, but it's we did a pretty good analysis of everything.
And let the record reflect that Mr. Booker is in attendance in the chambers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions or comments on this resolution? Seeing none, is there anyone opposed to this resolution? I see Mr. Tassoni, and we will cast a yes vote. And and I am also opposed. So we will, and let's go ahead and just take a roll call then.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mrs. Red. Mrs. Red. We will come back to Mrs. Red. Mr. Salgado.
Yes.
Mr. Schultz. I'm sorry, I always miss Mr. Schultz. Mr. Schultz.
Mr. Schultz's video is off. Let's come back to him.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Tassoni.
No.
Mr. Webster.
No.
Mr. Westcott.
Yes.
Mr. Zintak.
No.
Mr. Arena.
Yes.
Mr. Billich.
Yes.
Mr. Booker.
Yes.
Mr. Butita.
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby is absent. Mr. Fellers.
No.
Mr. Fiducia.
Yes.
Mr. Girl.
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel.
No.
Mr. Hoffman.
No.
Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly.
Yes.
That was a yes, Mr. Kelly. Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors.
Yes.
I'll go back to Mrs. Red. Mrs. Red, are you there?
I'm sorry, yes, I'm here.
Okay, Mrs. Red, your vote on this.
I'm sorry, I'm having audio problems. I didn't hear what I'm voting on.
This is the resolution identifying revenue increases or budget reductions to offset the sheriff's budget amendment.
I'm gonna abstain on that one.
Okay, I will go to Mr. Schultz, I believe is a yes. And he is shaking his head yes. Okay, and then I believe I come back to Mrs. Red is the last one. And is that a formal abstention?
Yes. Yes.
That motion is approved by 12, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Clerk Gamal. The motion is
No.
approved.
Thank you.
Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next item is Budget Amendment Ordinance 2020-020, Sheriff's Department budget by 2.7 and change. And I so move.
All right, we have a motion on Budget Amendment Ordinance 2020-020, the Sheriff's Department budget by 2.7 million. May I have a second, please? Seconded by Mr. Girl. Discussion.
Just to point out, give some context to this. Essentially, this is what the sheriff is anticipating his projection is going to be at the end of the year of an overspend of $2.7 million on his current budget. So this would essentially, if it gets passed, the budget amendment would go into effect, essentially acknowledging that. If it doesn't, then obviously, it would just show as an overspend on his year-to-year spending.
Thank you. Is there any other discussion or questions? Actually, I'll add one thing just real quick. I am against this budget amendment. I do not think we should be justifying or validating the sheriff's year-over-year overspending of his budget. And every time we approve an amendment like this, when he overspends his budget, we simply say it's okay. And I say enough is enough. I had Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I was not able to participate in the Finance Committee meeting when this budget amendment was discussed. So can we get an explanation from the Sheriff's Department on how this happened? Because this is a significant amount of money to be over budget. And I would just like to hear some details here of how that could happen to this extent.
So I see Mr. Saganik is on the Zoom call. Chief Deputy Saganik, would you want to comment on that?
Sure, I can address it, and I believe Tammy Grohl's on the call also. She has a detailed explanation that was actually with the budget amendment. But really, it comes down to a couple things. First of all, personnel. It's my understanding, and I wasn't here in October, but it's my understanding that there was 24 unfunded deputy positions, which comes to about $1.7 million. The court security was unfunded, which is another $250,000. And then there is the UIC medical budget, medical cost, which again, the sheriff was not a part of negotiating that deal, and that extra $1 million was put on the sheriff's office. So, when you add that up, that's where that $2.7 million comes from. It's really, when you look at what the sheriff has done this year, the majority, the 90% of our costs at the sheriff's office are personnel. With how much the sheriff has been cut over the last couple of years, the office is already at bare bones, and really, the sheriff has done an outstanding job actually of providing excellent public safety service to Winnebago with how little funding he gets. So that, I mean, that's kind of where we're at the sheriff's office, why we're here. I believe Tammy Grohl's on the call also, and she could probably give some other details. Tammy, you here?
And yes, I'm here. A couple other items. We've had a lot of senior employees retired, left employment this year. And we have to pay out vacation time. And year to date, we've paid out almost $133,000 in vacation time. Our overtime budget, I'm anticipating about a $641,000 over budget in the overtime. Non-bargaining unit employees received a raise, which was approved by the county on January 1st of 20, and that's about $65,000. And then I think Brett,
Sorry, go ahead, Tammy, if you have more.
no, I think Brett covered the rest of it.
All right, great. Mr. Arena, a follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm looking at the supporting documentation, and if I'm understanding this correctly, it says under regular salaries that $3,110,521 extra was spent on regular salaries. Is that correct?
What happens is we have budget in the 1%, we have budget in the general fund. All of our employees are budgeted in the 1%. So it's more of like if you look at the 3 million, that's the account 40116, that's the 1%. And then if you look up to 24000, that is the general fund. So there is a surplus there. So you've got to take that off of the 3 million, which would be about $2 million. Do you see that?
Yeah, so yes, I'm seeing that now. So you're saying you spent $2 million more on salary than what was budgeted.
That's correct.
Now, I guess I'm confused because Deputy Chief Saganek just mentioned unfunded deputies, and that amount wasn't $2 million, was it, that he just stated?
No, the 2020 budget is based off of the 2019 budget. In the 2019 budget, there was 24 deputies that were put into an account that had zero budget. So we would have started the fiscal year with a deficit because those positions were not funded in 2019.
But that was by agreement, right? When we settled the dispute that was going on at that time, if I recall correctly, part of the settlement was that those 24 deputies were not going to be part of the baseline of this year's budget. So that was by agreement.
That's
Was
correct.
it not?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so we agreed that funding wouldn't be part of the budget, but then it got spent anyway. So that's, I'm confused. If we agreed to something, I don't understand why it happened. Maybe Chief Saganek, can you enlighten me there?
Sure. You know what, Mr. Reno, obviously I was not here and I was not part of that agreement, but I can tell you that, the deputies are necessary to provide public safety. I mean, at some point, if you cut those 24 deputies, you're going to severely impact the services that the sheriff's office provides in the county. So, it's the work is still there. The calls are still there. The need for the police to respond is still there. So I would say that, my guesstimation is that the sheriff is responsible for the public safety in the county, and he decided that those officers were needed to provide adequate public safety for the county.
Well, I see your point, but I guess I'm troubled by the fact that I can only see it from the outside. So when they come to the table with an agreement, I would just assume that that's acceptable to all parties. So this aspect.
Again, Mr. Reno, I was not there for that agreement.
Well, I understand. I understand your point. I'm just expressing my opinion, so I'm on record with my thoughts. Thank you.
Okay.
May I ask a question, please?
Mrs. Gorel, please.
How many senior employed deputies retired this past year?
We had deputies, we had 7 retire or resigned. I don't know what a senior, but there's 7 total that we lost.
7 lost. And you picked up, what, 24 new ones?
We've hired 10.
You hired 10. So would that, you still not have the amount of income for the 7, so you would only need additional for 3 new personnel? Why would you need for all 10?
Overtime.
Yeah.
No, no.
Well, we actually, we entered into contractual agreements with the South Beloit School District, also with the Harlem School District, and that accounts for 3 officers. So those 3 additional officers are funded by the school district.
I'm going to step in here and ask a question real quick, if you're done, Ms. Gorel.
Yes.
I was under the impression that our payroll system did not allow you to add new employees to payroll if there wasn't budget to fund them. So I'm curious how we were able to add new employees to payroll if there was not a funding source for them. We went through this 3 years ago with Carla, and she put those guardrails into place that prevented someone from adding employees if there wasn't a funding source for them. So I guess I'm going to ask the question, how were these people hired if there wasn't a funding source? Right, because we've just said there were 24 unfunded positions. It would have required legally, it would have required a budget amendment to hire those people, to hire those new people. We went through this last year as well, and the year before when someone retired, the sheriff had to present us with a budget amendment to hire people to replace them because he was over budget.
I think this year, if there was a position, whether it was funded or not, if there was a vacant position, then it could be replaced.
I'm concerned that violates both our policy and potentially ordinance.
There is a requirement before you hire, there's a position requisition form that has to be filled out and through the accounting system. And then once that's approved, then you can hire an individual.
Mr. Fellers.
Go ahead, Ms. Gorel.
We need somehow or other to look into how this system works, because we remove 3 quit, and we get 5 back, but we're paying for 20 to come back. Something's wrong with this system. This system needs to be looked into. We are spending, this happens year after year after year. This is not new to any of us. It keeps cutting back and biting us that we keep adding all these. If we've totaled up how many staff we have added, we might have a whole army out there. I don't know, because I don't see where they're dropped off and they're picked up in the wages. Something's not balancing out properly. I do request that we have this looked into of how this keeps happening year after year after year, and it's blamed on public safety. To me, that term's been used too many times, and you can only buffalo yourself so much, and then you have to start looking into what's really happening in the background. And I do request that we have some type of an audit on how this system is working. Is it working properly? And look into the everyday hiring and firing and vacationing, the whole thing when it comes to employees. Thank you.
I've got Mr. Zintak, then Mr. Kelly, then Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a question. Rick mentioned the fact that they were putting officers in the school districts. Are the school districts paying for that time of those officers, or is that coming from the county?
Those positions are funded by the school district. We have separate contracts with both South Beloit and the Harlem School District, and they fund those positions.
Well, second to that question, from a revenue standpoint, from the sheriff's department, granted, you get funds from the fines and penalties in the court system and from tickets and so forth. How much of that is involved in the sheriff's budget? And a question, another on top of that, do they run overweights? I know state police run overweights. Is the county doing that?
You know, to answer your question, I don't have the exact numbers, but the fine and revenue, fines and other fees that we charge for things like civil process and stuff, that money goes back into the general fund. And I don't know what the exact numbers are for 2020. They're off a little bit because COVID and things are a little bit different. As far as your question is running overweights, frankly, we don't. It's something that brings a lot of revenue. We've had to cut our staff so much over the last several years that at this point, our patrol division is out there just trying to keep up answering the calls. We'd love to have a traffic unit that could do that, but we don't have the staff for it.
I mean, that's a good source of income, especially with all the construction going on, farm implements and so forth. That'd be something I'd like to see looked at into a little bit more.
Need staff.
Yeah, we'd absolutely want to do it. I mean, you keep in mind, we went from putting 10 deputies out on the street to now we're putting 6 deputies out on the street. So it's more difficult. It's obviously you got to keep up with the call volume. So our first priority is responding to calls for service.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Kelly?
Thank you, Chairman. The problem is we have a fundamental difference in our approach to budget between the county board and the sheriff. The sheriff looks at this big law enforcement thing called public safety and lays out what he thinks he needs and simply expects it. We look at it as though we have a pot of resources and this is what we can afford to allot him, and we should get the public safety that pot can afford. And that's our problem, is finding agreement between those two.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. I've got Mr. Booker next. Mr. Booker? We've lost your audio, Mr. Booker. Mr. Thompson?
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
I can hear you now, Mr. Booker.
go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. I just want to remind everyone that the sheriff has 22 less deputies now than when the sheriff was sworn in as sheriff of Winnebago County. With all due respect to Ms. Gorel, there is no army of deputies out there. Winnebago County has a crime problem, and we're working on a skeleton crew. Not all of the patrol areas are filled right now. There are deputies trying to respond to calls, not in one area that they're assigned to, but they're trying to handle calls in 2 areas. I also want to remind everyone that the sheriff submitted a budget and said, this is what I project that I need. The county board, the majority of the county board voted that down, and we gave
We've lost his audio.
Mr. Booker, we've lost your audio again. Mr. Booker, we've lost you. I've asked the help desk here if you can reach out to Mr. McDonald or Mr. Booker and see if we can figure out what's going on.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we missed the last about 30 seconds of that. Our apologies.
We need to meet in
start with Army.
We need to meet in person this technical glitches and it's getting to me. It's raising my blood pressure. We need to meet in person, but I digress. I'm going to try to get back to where I think I was to remind everyone that the sheriff submitted a budget, and he said he projected that this is what he would need. The board majority said no, turned it down, and the county board decided to give the sheriff a budget that we thought that the sheriff should live with. I knew, the sheriff knew, and most of us knew that the sheriff wasn't going to be able to live in that budget. So when I hear people say that year after year after year, the sheriff continues to overspend his budget, it's just simply not right. The sheriff knows what he needs. And this isn't a case where the sheriff is saying, this is what I need. We approved him what he needs. Then all of a sudden he says, well, I'm going to need a little bit more. No, this is a case where the county board decided on what budget he should live with, and we knew that he was going to be needing more. So I want to commend Mr. Chapman for finding the funding resources, and I think it would just be disrespectful to Mr. Chapman due to the time and effort that he put in to find these funding resources. And additionally, for the past 3 months, there's been an increase, a monthly increase to the county's general fund. We've gone from $188,000 per month to $215,000 per month. And now for the month of August, the federal government is paying into the county's general fund $252,000 for the month of August alone. Yes, I understand we've got to pay for corrections officers and for the care and security of the federal inmates. But doggone, we've got to take a look at the revenue, the positive revenue that is coming in, and we've got to look at public safety. Crime is going up, and the personnel in the sheriff's department is going down, and that has to stop. Thank you.
I'll add just one quick point of clarification. 2 years ago, we had an agreement with the sheriff on a budget that he agreed to, that we agreed to, and the following year he sued us because we didn't give him enough money, even though he agreed to the budget we gave him. Are there any other comments or questions regarding this budget amendment ordinance 2020-020? Mr. Arena, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Village, you're next.
Mr. Chapman, do you know, to Mr. Booker's point, that how much less was budgeted for the sheriff than he requested at the beginning of this year? And then I have a follow-up question.
I do not know. Those decisions were made before I came on board. So I'm sorry, I couldn't answer that. I know there was the issue of the medical contract not being budgeted. And as far as the additional deputies, I assume it was the 1.7 million, but I can't say for sure that's what it was. So.
Ms. Gorel, do you know, Tammy Gorel, do you know what that amount was?
Tammy?
You know what? I'm looking it up right now. I'm looking up on the computer.
Okay,
Let's go back to
I'll ask my second question then, and
Right.
if you can come back with the answer. So, Mr. Chapman, what's the actual effect if this budget amendment fails, right? The money's being spent, these bills will be paid. It doesn't affect public safety. To me, these budget amendments seem like an accounting practice that we're, basically approving what has occurred. But if we disapprove of it, nothing's going to change, right?
At this point in time, no, because we're almost at the end of the fiscal year.
Okay, thank you. And Tammy, if you come up with that information and you could chime in.
Looking back in my notes, it looks like we requested 29.6 million for the budget for this year. And then we asked for additional funding. That would be for funding current personnel, additional funding for supplies, and another 6.8 million for a total of 36.4. That's what our request was. And what was approved was 28.5.
Have you ever gotten a budget of over $36 million?
Hang on, I've got that in front of me also. Back in 2017, we were at 37.9. 2016, 36.2.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Billich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, I want to go back and just commend and agree with what Mr. Booker's put out there, because I'm not going to pretend that I'm an officer, that I know what an officer's job entails or what the sheriff's department needs. However, I can listen to those who actually know more about it than I do. In regards to that, actually, after discussing with multiple other people that have either, worked for the sheriff's department or anything like that, but when I think about it, if someone had a question in the restaurant industry and asked me, what's the best practice, or is this common, or something like that, I would expect that kind of question to go towards me. So when I would give an answer on that, then I would anticipate that it would have a little bit more weight to it. That's why I'm actually going to go ahead and say that I do agree with what Mr. Booker said. Now, in regards to the budget question, Mr. Arena, I want to commend you on that question. Actually, I was going to ask the same question, so I thank you for asking that before me, because it's a good answer there. Because the fact of the matter is that we do have a sheriff's department. We have an area that we have to look at and work on regularly as elected officials. One of the biggest things that we got to focus on in the county, aside from making sure that we're on budget, we actually have to focus on making sure that our public has the public safety that they deserve. And at this stage, we've been told multiple times that we are not meeting certain requirements, that we need to work more on it. And one of the biggest issues that we've had with was actually the count of deputies and staffing. And in that regard, I'm going to listen to what they need. In regards to the budget, I agree 100%. We do need to be budget minded, especially in these times. One of the biggest things that I wanted to touch on was what Mr. Booker said. He is operating with less than the appropriated deputies. That's actually been confirmed by multiple other people. However, at this point, the sheriff's department actually also, if I remember correctly, when we were discussing Axon deals and other deals and expenditures, he's tried and he's sworn part of his budget towards those expenditures. Mr. Tagana can actually correct me on that one. I do believe when we were discussing in the Axon deal, part of the sheriff's part of the costs were going to be covered by part of the sheriff's budget, and he was more than willing to do so. At this point, you can't say that we anticipated a lot of the expenditures of this year. We're in a very weird year. 2020 has not been great to anybody, especially government entities. So in this case, I just want to make sure that we're focusing on doing the best that we can for our community. I mean, at the end of the day, one of our biggest expenditures and one of our biggest tasks and jobs as community officials is to make sure that our public feels safe and secure. It helps in our booming economy. And when we can have a booming economy, it helps to make sure that we actually have this kind of sense of safety, and that the businesses that are coming to the area are going to feel comfortable putting businesses up here, that they're not going to be put in harm's way, or that their staff is going to be put in harm's way. What that does then is that a lot of the businesses, when their staff is put in harm's way, have to spend a lot of money on security. And so in that regard, I want to make sure that we're putting the community's needs first and foremost. And I hope that we can actually see what Mr. Chapman can come up with in regards to finding any other kind of budget things that we can actually fix towards this, so that we can actually come to a good, nice, balanced budget. Or if we do need to have extra expenditures out of it, to make sure that we know what we're spending it on. I have full faith that Mr. Chapman will be able to do that for us. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Billich. Are there any other questions regarding Budget Amendment 2020-020? Mr. Arena, we'll go back to you again.
I'm sorry. I'll make this my last one. I just want to make sure I understood this correctly. Tammy Gorel, those past budgets that you mentioned of 36 million, 37 million, that was budgeted, that was granted to you, or that was the budget you requested in those past years?
That was approved budgets.
Okay, well, I think I was not aware of that, and that's a significant difference from where we're at now. So thank you for that information.
Mr. Neighbors, comment? You're on mute, Mr. Neighbors.
Mr. Thompson had his hand up for quite a while, so Let him go, then I'll go after that.
No, go ahead, Tim. Go ahead.
What I wanted to say was I understand that we need to make sure the public is safe, and I don't, we're going around on this this specific resolution on the budget amendment, but at the same time, I agree with Mr. Booker and I agree with Mr. Village on the safety concerns of the public, but at the same time, we have to be concerned with the budget. So since we're working with a smaller amount of the budget, if we increase the police budget and give them everything they need, give them everything they want, and then they increase their arrests for public safety, where does that leave the state's attorney's office? Because with more arrests becomes more prosecution. And then when we get more prosecution, are we going to tell the state's attorney we're going to give them more money too? So we can't do that. It has to be a good balance, because we have a whole lot of departments to work with, and it's not fair that all the other departments have to suffer, because once you increase one, you have to increase the rest of them, because more departments coincide or depend on the other department. So just be careful with the comments that you make on, increasing public safety. It's true, but we still have a budget to work with.
Mr. Thompson, sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to try to assist the board in moving this issue forward. I want to reassure the board that I will dig into this and address the concerns that have been raised by the board. I will establish good working relationships with Chief Saganek, Tammy Gorel, and the sheriff. And these issues hopefully can be resolved within the next months, and so that we don't have to go through these kinds of difficult discussions and debates in the future. So I just want to reassure the board, I'm 9 days into my tenure as administrator, but trust me, I will dig into this and reassure the board that we won't have to go through this type of discussion again in the future. Thank you.
Mr. Webster.
Thank you. It's interesting, the last couple of questions Mr. Arena asked and reflected how the numbers have gone down over the years. But what Mr. Neighbors is saying, and I think what he's getting at least I got it, let's put things into context, because back in the days there when we were more flush with cash, so to speak, we had our budgets that were $225 million budgets. And now our budget is down to what, 185. So it's not just the sheriff's department budget that has gone down. All of ours across the board have gone down. So, back in the days there when there was 28 board members on the board there, we didn't have to have so many fights, I don't think, over how much to fund each one. It was just, the more fights were like, how come he got that and I didn't in my department, or whatever sort of thing. But back then, trust me, we had $227 million budgets. And I think Mr. Chapman can verify that. So, keep things in context when we talk about this cuts, as so to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Are there any other comments or questions regarding this budget amendment? Mr. Billich, we'll go back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question. Mr. Chapman, in regards to, I had spoken with Jaime before and met with Jaime and Mr. Booker on this as well. But in regards to the marijuana tax money that's supposed to be coming in, I know that, do we know what kind of numbers we're going to be looking at? And is there any way we can actually attribute that towards any of these shortfalls? Aside from that, we were discussing on actually making sure that we directed a portion of that money to offset, because Mr. Neighbors made a great point. But the state's attorney's office has been kind of underfunded for years. It's been known around our area that we're one of the counties that are not really funding that department as much as we can be. And we definitely need to see if we can make sure that those revenues keep coming in. They do a great job, just sometimes funding is an issue. But is marijuana tax money, is there any information on that at all?
Not at this time. That tax just started July 1st, so it's only been a month. We won't see any money from that until October. And to be honest with you, we did factor in revenue from the tax into the 2021 budget. I believe we factored in $200,000, but we're still going to be short 6.1 million. So that 200,000 really doesn't make a big difference. So
Very small amount. Yeah, we definitely got late on that one and they pushed everyone back from collecting that. So I understand. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments from the board?
Mr. Fellers,
Go ahead, Mr. Gorel.
I just want to ask the board members who've been on the board probably as long as I have or longer than I have. Do you ever remember the Sheriff's Department having a $36 million budget? Do you ever remember them having maybe a 30,000 budget and $30 million budget? I don't remember budgets higher than that. If you do, then please correct me. I sure would like to be corrected on that, because up to recently, the highest I've seen it is about 28, 29 million. I'd never seen it go over the 30 million. So I would love to be corrected on this. Thank you.
And I believe part of that also, Ms. Gorel, we also 2 years ago removed, was it health insurance? Or what we removed, it was health insurance or something like health insurance as a line item. So that was now in the administration budget. So like some of that money that was cut out, to the tunes of, some millions, wasn't cut from the budget, but it was moved from the sheriff's budget over to the administration budget because we were handling that level of insurance for the county as a whole. So to say we went from a $36 million budget to a $28 million budget isn't necessarily 100% accurate. I know my budget books are about sitting 15 feet away, and I can't quite get to them for the last few years, but can't quite get to them right now. But I think we've got those numbers, and we can go back and review and continue as we continue these negotiations and conversations into the 2021 fiscal budget. That said, is there any other comment or question from board members? Seeing none, I'm going to go ahead and ask the clerk to call the roll. Clerk Kamau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Salgado,
No.
Mr. Schultz, Mr. Schultz. I think that was a no.
Mr. Schultz, will you put your answer in the chat just so we can confirm?
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Mr. Tassoni,
No.
Mr. Webster,
No.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Zintak.
Yes.
That was a yes, Mr. Zintak.
That was good.
Thank you.
Kind of cool.
Mr. Arena,
I'm shaking that. Oh, good.
that was a no, Mr. Arena.
No.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm getting a lot of feedback.
Mrs. Rudd, would you please mute or cover your microphone? We're catching a lot of extra noise from your flying.
Thank you. Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mr. Fellers,
No.
Mr. Fiducia,
No.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
No.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
No.
Mrs. Red,
No.
and I see by the chat box, Mr. Schultz was a no. Mr. Chairman, that is 9 yes, 10 no, and 1 absent.
The motion fails. Back to you, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next item is a budget overview presentation proposing the fiscal year 2021 for the county board. So I'd like to give this opportunity to Mr. Chapman, Mr. Thompson to kind of go through the details on that, and we'll move on to the other 2 items.
Okay, Mr. Chapman, Mr. Thompson, do you have anything you want to screen share, or are you just going to be speaking to us off the packet?
We're gonna just be speaking to you, not necessarily off the packet, but just kind of a generalization of where we're at with the budget and so on. We did have a finance committee meeting last night that looked at some information that the chairman, Mr. Salgado, had asked for regarding the 1% and the public safety sales tax budgets, as far as what potential impact could be from reductions in the individual budgets and so on. That information was shared with the committee. There was discussion about what committee members felt needed to be looked at in terms of those 2 particular budgets as far as future actions. The budget amount, the budget that's laying over tonight pretty much reflects budgets that have been submitted by the departments, and we will presumably at our next meeting, Mr. Thompson and myself make some recommendations on how to close the gap in at least the general fund and 1% fund. Outside of that, I really don't have anything else to share at this time. We did go through the presentation at the last meeting regarding those 2 funds as far as revenues and expenditures. So hopefully you had a chance to look at that information. And if you have any questions, you can give either one of us a call. So.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. First blush, looking at the budget, I'm sure that the board cringes when they see a $6 million gap. But I believe that between Steve and I and the finance staff, we're going to be able to develop a budget recommendation for the board and for the finance committee. But it will have to be a combination of suggestions or recommendations. There will be some revenue increases. There will be some expenditure reductions, not to the level that was laid out in the exercise that was asked for by the finance committee for Steve to prepare a scenario of 10% cuts. We're not going to present a recommendation to the board with 10% across the board budget reductions, but there will be some revenue increases. I think we're going to look at host fees potentially, possibly some fund balance. I don't think we should rely on fund balance applied to help balance the budget, because that sets us up for a structural imbalance going into the next year's budget. And then also, I know the most difficult part of the discussion, but I think it needs to be part of the overall discussion, is to going to the top of the levy limit. And I know that some board members will cringe at that, but to balance this budget and to close a $6 million gap, it's going to take compromise and negotiation on all elements of the budget. So we can't just look at the expenditure side of the budget. We certainly will, but we also have to look at the revenue side as well. And so my pledge to the board, and I will work very closely with Steve, is that we will present a balanced budget to the Finance Committee. But it will involve some very difficult decisions, but it will be a compromise and hopefully a discussion by the entire board and some compromise from all of us, and even from department heads and elected officials. This is a very difficult budget that I'm stepping into, but Steve has done a stellar job in presenting a lot of good information and data for us to be able to make decisions. And I look forward to the discussion with the Finance Committee in the next few weeks and the county board towards the end of September. But that's my pledge to the board, that we will give you our best recommendation for a balanced budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I think I speak for all of us when I say that you certainly have your work cut out for you. Are there any questions or comments for Mr. Chapman or Mr. Thompson at this time? If you do, this would be the part of the agenda to ask. Seeing none, I'll hand it back to you, Mr. Salgado.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just so everybody knows, from a contextual purpose, the budget, the ordinance that we're going to put out there is essentially with the new construction a piece on it, and with, essentially eating into the reserves. That's currently what's being laid over. As Mr. Thompson, Mr. Chapman has alluded to, they're working on a balanced budget. It was an exercise that they presented yesterday. Overall, obviously, there's concerns from departments saying, hey, I won't be able to take that 10% if we do a straight up 10%. It was just an exercise to see where we're at, what it would take to cover that $6.1 million gap for a balanced budget. So more to come. I'm hoping next week we'll have a finance committee meeting and to address some of these issues, give direction, context, what that budget is going to look like. So we're not at the 11th and 12th hour, even though we seem to find ourselves every single year in the same dilemma. So with that, I'd like to move on to item number 5, which is the fiscal year 2020 budget to be laid over to September 24, 2020 meeting. And then also item 6, which is the fiscal year 2021 annual appropriation ordinance to be laid over to September 24, 2020 meeting.
And those items will be laid over to the September 24th, 2020 meeting.
And that thank you.
All right. Zoning Committee, Mr. Webster, welcome back to the show.
Hey, we got here. Thank you. Okay. We have 4 items from zoning. These were read in last week. And in this week that's lapsed, I haven't heard any questions, comments, any feedback from any board members. I'll start out by telling you all 4 of these matters that we're voting on tonight, all 4 failed at zoning committee. So with that, we have Z0420, that's a map amendment. And that failed both at ZBA and at zoning committee. And V0120, that was a failure there as well. That was a variance. The accompanying piece to that, number 3, is SU0120. That was a special use as well. And the other part of that was number 4 on your agenda there, SU0220 is a special use permit. And so all of the last 3 on there, the 2 are special uses and 1's a variance. And because the variance failed, that requires a supermajority vote to approve. And so with that, I'm going to ask the state's attorney, can we vote on all these en masse, or do we need to separate them, Mr. Kalinkas?
Mr. Kalinkas?
Sorry, I couldn't find myself on the computer. If you, I mean, the board can do whatever they want to do. If you want to vote on them all at once, that's fine. If you want to separate them out, that's fine. It's whatever the convenience of the board, but there's nothing that prohibits you from taking them all at once.
Mr. Webster, may I suggest maybe we separate out item 1 as that's the separate piece, and then maybe once we do that, we can entertain a motion to take 2, 3, and 4 all together.
That would be fine by me. I knew before I asked Mr. Kalinka's question, but I wanted to double down on that, so I wasn't giving you a line of BS. But yeah, the board can separate all of them, or just take number 1 and then leave 2, 3, and 4 because they're from the same applicant.
All right, let's do that. So can we get a motion on ZO420, the map amendment to rezone plus or minus 1.47 acres from the AG Ag Priority District to the Rural Residential District? I've got a motion by Mr. Kelly, a second by Mr. Zintak. Is there any discussion regarding this motion? Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just curious. This was approved by ZBA unanimously and then denied by the zoning committee. Can we get a little explanation of what the situation is and the reason for the denial at the zoning committee?
Okay, I think the main reason was and I'm going from staff report, while the proposed residential zoning is consistent with the medium density, 2 lines down from that, it says leaving the remnant 7.9 acres zoned ag is inconsistent. So that was a little ambiguous there. And so we felt that for the most part, that was probably the reason why. So at any rate, so that failed there at our committee.
So if I could just follow up, the property owner is doing this because they want to build a house?
Correct. They want to sell it in order for someone to build a house on it.
Okay, so denying this will, okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Because this failed at the zoning committee, I'm going to go ahead and just ask the clerk to call the roll on this one. So just so that we're clear, a yes vote would pass the map amendment, a no vote, and it will fail. Clerk Gamal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. Schultz. Thank you, Mr. Schultz. That is a no in the chat box. Mr. Tassoni.
No.
Mr. Webster.
No.
Mr. Westcott.
No.
Mr. Zintek.
No. No.
Thank you, Mr. Arena.
Yes.
Mr. Billich.
No.
Mr. Booker.
No.
Mr. Butita.
Yes.
Mr. Fellers.
No.
Mr. Fiducia.
No.
Mr. Girl.
No.
Mrs. Gorel.
No.
Mr. Hoffman.
No.
Mr. Kelly.
I was a yes in committee and I'm a yes now.
Mr. McDonald.
No.
Mr. Neighbors.
Yes.
Mrs. Red.
No.
Mr. Salgado.
Yes.
the agenda.
Mr. Chairman, that is 5 yes, 14 no, and 1 absent on the map amendment.
Thank you, Clerk Gummow. The motion fails. Mr. Webster.
Okay, then I would make a motion to approve VO 120, SUO 120, and SU 0220.
Okay, I have a motion to take all three of, I have a motion for VO 120, SU 0120, SU 0220. May I please have a second? Mr. Girl with the second, and to remind you that a supermajority is required to pass the variance, and if
And
that
they-
fails, they all fail.
And they all come with conditions.
Thank
That's
you,
what
Mr. Webster.
majority is all about.
Any discussion on these three items? Seeing none, does anyone support any of these items? See, so seeing that Mr. Tassone or Mr. Tassone is the, and Mr. Billich?
I want to. Like
Sorry,
to
go ahead.
speak to Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Mr. Tassone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just in relationships to item 2, 3, and 4, I believe the roll call picks me first this time around. And I would just say no on items 2 and 4 and yes on 3 is what I'd like to be recorded as.
Okay, we can record that. You know what, let's look, yeah, we took them all together, Mr. Tassone. So it's either an up or down vote altogether. And as a reminder, SU 0120 requires the variance. Is that correct, Mr. Webster?
Yes, that's the key to it there. The variance, without the variance, neither one of the special uses is any good. So it's a moot point to approve this, either one of the special uses, because they don't have the variance to use the property in that manner. And so that's.
May I interrupt? If I
Go ahead.
remember correctly, that with the tree farm, that person can cut the trees down and bring them to another place and sell them. They cannot come on that property and cut down their own trees and carry them out. But that tree farm person can cut them down and take them to another place and sell them.
Thank you,
That's
Mr.
how that,
Cole.
David.
Okay, because there's just a little bit of confusion around this, well, let's just go back here. Mr. Tassone, does that answer your question?
I didn't have a question, Mr. Chairman. I just want the record to show that I'm in favor of item 3 and against 2 and 4.
Okay.
And I didn't know they were, I guess I missed that they were all read in together. I thought we separated and we're going to read through them one at a time.
Okay. We are technically at the stage of voting right now and discussion should be closed. I see Mr. Kelly. So unless there's any objection, I'm going to back off and ask Mr. Kelly here. Go ahead, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Chairman. Really, what we need here is a motion to divide the question, which I will do.
I have a motion by Mr. Kelly to divide up items 2, 3, and 4 and take them individually, and a second by Mr. Tassone. Is there any discussion? Is there anyone opposed to dividing these up and taking them individually? Not seeing any. Oh, I see Mr. Girl is, let the record reflect that Mr. Girl is opposed to taking these separately.
I just have a question.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If we take number 2 and number 2 fails, 3 and 4 is a moot point, correct?
That is correct.
That is absolutely correct.
Can we just vote on number 2 then? That would be my motion.
Okay. Hold off, Mr. Girl.
Okay.
No, you can't.
We have an emotion on the floor to separate these items out. Is there anyone opposed to that motion? Seeing none, I'm going to cast a yes vote. We're going to take these out and do them individually. We have first one. Can I start over again? Can I get a motion to approve V0120, the variation to allow a minimum of 74 foot of lot frontage? Motion by Mr. Tassone. May I have a second? I have a second by Mr. Girl. The item is now before the board. Is there any discussion on the variation to allow a minimum 74-foot lot frontage width on a public road instead of the required 250 feet in the ag district? Seeing no discussion, is there anyone, I'm gonna ask you to call the roll on this one, Clerk Gamow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You are correct. We will start with Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. My vote is no.
Mr. Webster,
No.
Mr. Westcott,
No.
Mr. Zintak,
No.
Mr. Arena,
No.
Mr. Billich,
No.
Mr. Booker,
No.
Mr. Butita,
No.
is absent, Mr. Fellers,
No.
Mr. Fiducia,
No.
Mr. Girl,
No.
Mrs. Gorel,
No.
Mr. Hoffman,
No.
Mr. Kelly,
No.
Mr. McDonald,
No.
Mr. Neighbors,
No.
Mrs. Red,
No.
Mr. Salgado,
No.
Mr. Schultz.
No.
Thank you. I heard you, Mr. Schultz. Mr. Chairman, that would be 19 noes and 1 absent.
The motion fails. Mr. Webster, to simplify this, may I ask for a motion to reject SU 0120?
Reject? I don't know. I don't know why you would, I don't know why you'd ask to reject. These are matters that were properly dealt with at committee and so forth. And I think that either put them back together again and vote on them two together, or vote on them individually.
I will leave that to you, Mr. Webster.
So I would make a motion then. I would make a motion to make a, seeing how Mr. Johnson wanted to separate out the number 3 on your agenda, SU 0120, for the Christmas trees. If that's what he wanted, let's vote on that separately, and then we'll go to the SU 0220.
Can we get a motion then on item number 3? SU 0120, a special use permit for an agribusiness to allow a U-Pick operation. I have a motion
So
by
moved.
Mr. Kelly, a second by Mrs. Gorel. Is there any discussion on this matter?
Yes,
Go ahead, Mr. Webster.
thank you. Just as a reminder, even if everybody voted yes for this, she still couldn't operate as a cut your own Christmas tree because the variance went down in flames. So the variance is the key to it. If you don't have the variance for the road frontage, you can't get the special use permit either for the Christmas trees or for the wedding venue. And so that's why I say to you, it's a moot point. But to honor Mr. Tassoni's request, yes, let's go ahead and vote on them separately.
Okay. Is there any other discussion on SU 0120? Is there any board member that supports this motion? Okay. Let the record reflect that Mr. Tassoni, Mr. Kelly, and Mr. Billich support this motion and cast a no vote for all other members present. Motion fails. Mr. Webster.
Thank you. We're getting there. Okay, SU 0220 is a special use permit pertaining to the wedding and reception venue at the same location.
Okay, that was the motion, Mr. Webster.
Okay, so I'll make a motion to approve, yes.
I have a motion to approve SU 0220 special use permit for a wedding and or reception facility in the Ag Priority District for this property. I have a second by Mrs. Gorel. Any
Dorothy
discussion?
Red. And
Okay.
Dorothy,
Seconded by Dorothy Red. Dorothy, did you have a comment or just seconding?
Just a second.
Okay. Is there any discussion on this matter? Is there any member that supports this motion? Seeing none, the clerk will cast a no vote for all members present. The motion fails. Mr. Webster.
Roll call.
Okay, thank you. That's all we have this evening. Thank God.
Okay. That concludes the zoning committee. Economic Development Committee, Mr. Billich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have no report today.
Thank you, Mr. Billich. Operations and Administrative Committee, Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've got two resolutions for this evening. First is resolution establishing the date, time, and location of each meeting of the Winnebago County Board, and I so move.
Okay, we have a motion by Mr. McDonald for a resolution establishing the date, time, and location of each meeting of the Winnebago County Board. May I have a second? Mr. Hoffman. Is there any discussion on the resolution before the board? Seeing none, is there any board member opposed to this resolution? The clerk will cast a yes vote for all members present. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, sir. The second resolution is authorizing fire alarm signaling and monitoring and lease services agreement, and I so move.
Okay, we have a motion by Mr. McDonald on a resolution authorizing fire alarm signal monitoring and lease services agreement. May I have a second, please? Second by Mr. Booker. Is there any discussion on this resolution? Mr. Arena.
I have a question. I thought of it after committee. When this was presented in committee, there was just the one vendor. And I'm just curious if we're required to get two quotes, or is that not necessary on this item? I'm just curious why we didn't get a second quote. I'm Ann Johns, I don't know, is here tonight, but maybe someone from the state's attorney's office might know, or maybe Mr. McDonald knows.
I think Ann is on the call.
Yes, hi, this is Ann. I'm on the call. Can you hear me?
Yes, Ms. Johns, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Yes, the reason is because this is the city of Rockford. We're entering in, basically, it's almost like a joint purchasing with them. They are going to be our vendor. So that's why the price, they're not in it for making a profit. So this is a very good deal. And the school district's already signed on. And we're actually the second vendor to go online with them. So there's no need for another quote when it's another government entity you're partnering with.
Thank you for the explanation.
Sure.
Are there any other questions or comments from board members? Seeing none, are any members opposed to this resolution? Seeing none, the clerk will cast a yes vote for all members present. Mr. McDonald.
That concludes the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Public Works Committee, Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have no report. I anticipate our next Public Works meeting to be on September 18th.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Tassoni. Public Safety Committee, Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. Public Safety Committee brings forward two resolutions. The first resolution is authorizing funding for the Rosecrans Crisis Triage Program, and I so move.
I have a motion by Mr. Booker on a resolution authorizing funding for the Rosecrans Crisis Triage Program. May I please have a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Zintak and Ms. Gorel. Discussion.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to remind everyone that this is a budgeted item. It has been a budgeted item. And Mr. Chapman and I agree that we would place this in form of a resolution. So that's all that this is. Thank you.
Great. Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Chairman. Shouldn't this really go to the new mental health board and for being funded from that tax?
May I answer that, please? Mr. Kelly, first of all, they have no money, and so it's kind of hard to ask them to do that. Second of all, no, this should not be theirs unless they decide, or you ask for a grant for them to do that. Mr. Neighbors, am I right?
That's right, and it's already an existing program, and we're only allowed to work with new programs so far.
You are aware Mr. Neighbors is on that committee.
Great. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
the, thank you for the description, Ms. Gorel. Are there any other questions or comments from board members? Go ahead, Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to share with the board some questions that were asked in committee about this. One was, what other units of government have been contributing? And the response we got is no one else has. We're the only one. Secondly, we had asked if it's strictly limited to Winnebago County residents, and it's not. The information I obtained today was that over the last 5 years, Winnebago County residents have utilized the program around 80% of the time, higher or lower. And then from there, you have some use from Boone, Ogle, Cook, McHenry, and Stevenson. So I'm just giving this information for, you know, you to be aware of it. We're the one funding it, but there are residents from other counties participating. I'm going to vote for it now because I think it's an important service to provide to our residents. But moving forward, if this comes up again, two things. I agree with Mr. Kelly that it should be funded from the mental health tax, and we may look to these other counties that are benefiting from it but not contributing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arena. And I'll just add there, thank you for doing the research into this. I know those questions came up a lot at the last committee meeting, and I think it would behoove this board or the administration in the future to reach out to our partner counties, you know, and remind them that this is a resource that is available for them and it does not come for free. Are there any other questions or comments? Mr. Billich. You're on mute, Mr. Billich.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say that I agree with exactly what you just said and what Mr. Arena said, and Mr. Kelly. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Billich. Any other questions or comments from board members? Seeing none, is there anyone opposed to passing this resolution? Seeing no opposition, the clerk will cast a yes vote for all members present. Back to you, Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The second resolution is awarding bids for county towing services, and I so move.
Okay, I have a motion by Mr. Booker on a resolution awarding bids for county towing services. May I please have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Zintak. Any discussion from board members? Ms. Johns, do you want to just give 30 seconds on this one, since I know it was slightly complicated, and it'd probably be good if the whole board heard how this is playing out.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that, Chairman. This is something that's bid every 5 years. In the past, you might have known it as impound towing. We just called it towing services for this case. And this is when the deputies are on the road and there's an impound that they need to have called, or if there's an accident and the vehicle needs to be towed. These are the rates that are then charged. The towing rates for the impounds do not cost us anything. These are the rates that the people's cars that are towed. At the same time, at the very bottom, you'll see optional services. Those are services when our deputies are on the highway and they have a tire change or something, so they don't have to be on the road doing those type of things. It is a danger. And then also, this contract allows for towing of county-owned vehicles. So if an animal service vehicle needs to be hauled to auction or to service or has a flat tire, then we have those hauled. What was decided in this case, and it was a decision made by the sheriff's office, by Mark Carner and Chief Dominic Barcelona, that they wanted to award to both vendors. Haas currently has the city contract. A to Z has had our contract for the last 5 years. And so this way we'll work with both vendors, and whoever can come maybe the quickest to an accident scene, whoever has the best price for that, they'll be able to do that. But this will leave it up to the deputies to decide. when they're in that accident scene or in that need, they can do as they please. And so this is why we're proposing two awards. It'll be a 5-year contract, a 2-year, and 3 individual contracts from then on.
Thank you, Ms. Johns. Any other questions or comments from board members? Seeing none, is there any board member opposed to this resolution? Seeing none, Clerk Gummo will please cast a yes vote for all members present. Back to you, Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That concludes the report for public safety, but if I may, with the board's permission, and it was due to me running behind and not making it in time for board member correspondence, if I just may pass something along with the board's permission.
Go ahead, Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last week, we mourned the passing of a esteemed state's attorney, and I was just notified today that we have lost yet another esteemed former state's attorney. Mr. Chuck Prorock passed away quietly. He was a gentleman in every sense of the word, unassuming, kind, considerate, caring, a distinguished gentleman. And at one point, he was even second in command of the Winnebago County State's Attorney's Office, serving the citizens of Winnebago County with distinction was in the office with Mr. Paul Logley and such. So heartfelt prayers and thoughts to Mr. Chuck Prorock's friends and family. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Booker. We will keep his friends and family in our hearts tonight. Moving on to new business. Are there any items on for new business? Seeing none, I guess I will entertain a motion to adjourn. A motion by Mr. Webster, a second by everybody. Is there anyone opposed to adjourning?
Have a good weekend, everybody.
Have a great weekend. We are adjourned.